I just wanted to thank Roger Ames and the Bergman Institute for the invitation to speak. I feel a little bit out of place because I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an historian and intellectual historian, I guess. I've been working in recent years on comparative ethics and politics, concentrating in the axial period. I teach a course for undergraduates at Harvard called Care of the Soul. It's about traditions of moral self-cultivation in the axial period, that is second half of the first millennium BC. So we concentrate on Aristotle, Plato, Stoics for the Western tradition, and then the Confucian tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And also in recent years, I've been doing work on political meritocracy and comparative historical perspective, trying to talk about traditions of how to improve the quality of governance in different civilizations, especially Chinese and Western civilizations. So when I was writing this paper, I took my remit to engage with Professor Tingyang Zhao's monograph, All Under Heaven, which I found extremely interesting. And I'm in general agreement that the international order that's constituted by competing nation states, so-called Westphalian order, each state regarded as sovereign and self-determining, is inherently dangerous, and some other basis needs to be found. It's certainly not been productive of any type of lasting world peace. I think the atomic bomb gets more credit for world peace than Westphalian system. I have to admit that I think the idea of sovereign self-determining states does have some advantages, especially when it comes to legitimacy, because in the modern world, democratic legitimacy seems to be the only one that's widely accepted, at least by international elites. But I think it's possible to keep the advantages of democratic legitimacy in a different sort of world order, properly constituted world order. And that's what I'm talking about in connection with the word dyarchy, which is in my title. I'll get back to that later. So I have two main points that I'm trying to make in the paper. The first is to express a certain skepticism about the possibility of finding common rule, rights, laws, constitutions that could be a basis for a sounder international order. My main objection comes to the Confucian tradition, the Western tradition of political meritocracy. The whole idea that rules, laws, rights, and constitutions are useless unless the persons creating, interpreting, and enforcing these laws are themselves morally good, competent, persons of wisdom and competence who've been trained to care for the common good. In other words, the rules alone don't get you very far. You have to have people enforcing or interpreting or presenting the rules who are good. And that's just one of the standard teachings of Confucianism and Stoicism and lots of Western traditions as well. The people have to have the leaders of society, the gentlemen, the shunsa, whatever, they have to have virtue and benevolence if order is to be accepted. So my argument in the paper is that these behavioral norms don't come from taking courses at the Kennedy School of Government on leadership, but on civilizational traditions. That's where morally excellent people come from, the civilizational traditions. And I agree with Professor Walzer that there's no such thing as a global politics. That's, I think, by definition of politics, you simply can't have global politics. But I also think that global virtue is impossible. Virtue is nurtured by civilizational traditions, including religions, philosophy, education, culture, and what the Romans called the mos maiorum, the way of our ancestors, the traditions. That's where you get good behavior from. not just in leaders, but also in peoples. That you ask why most people have any kind of inward orientation to keep the moral law, I think 9 times out of 10, it's going to come from their religion, maybe also from their parents and families, and education, upbringing. It's not coming from intellectuals elaborating a system of rules. So post-Enlightenment attacks on all of these traditions, all the world civilizational traditions, and a rigid focus on the future at the expense of the past, the idea everything in the past is bad, everything in the future is going to be good, especially if we, the intellectuals, design it. Ultimately, this destroys civilization, and with it, the hope of civilized behavior. And you need civilized behavior if you're going to have any sort of world leadership that attracts the trust and compliance of peoples around the world. So the West, we're still living on the pre-Enlightenment capital of our ancient traditions, but it's rapidly running out because of the assault on our civilized traditions. Civilized behavior doesn't come from global civilization. In my opinion, that's impossible. There is no such thing as global civilization, although it's often talked about. If we tried to bring it into existence, it would probably be a horror show. But the persons who have acquired virtue in their various civilizational traditions will be the best people to create an international order that can be trusted by persons from many countries and cultures. And what all of the great moral traditions of the axial period wanted in politics was willing obedience, they would have said. Compliance is the bureaucratic word for obedience. Willing obedience and not coercion, right? If people will follow their rulers, we would say today, or obey their rulers willingly, that's the gold standard for Stoicism, Confucianism, Buddhist kingship, and so forth. So that's my first point, is the need to preserve civilizational traditions and the belief, my belief that an international order has to be maintained by people who have a kind of the charisma of virtue that is prized in various civilizational traditions. People know it when this is something that comes through very clearly in the American election system, is people are able to size you up, may not even be by what you say, but the way you look. And people who have moral authority exude that moral authority. And that's what you need to have an international order. So my second point addresses how an international order could be created, which enhances and doesn't destroy civilizational inheritances, allows civilizations to flourish. And what I'm proposing, or as a possible model, is a kind of 3-level model. In the papers that I've heard so far and last night, people talk about the nation state versus international order. That is a kind of, there's 2 competing sources of order. And the problem is how to create an international order that will recognize the validity of the local. So I'm suggesting there might be a 3-tier order in our concept of international order. The state, the realm of politics, the civilization, the realm of culture, and we would probably talk here about Western culture, maybe Confucian cultures, Hindu cultures, Buddhist cultures, and then the world order. And I think that this order should be diarchic. Dyarchies is a term I took from the Holy Roman Empire. It's the form of order that was existed in medieval Europe before they invented Westphalian order in the 17th century. Westphalian order was essentially invented to deal with a world of competing religions, Protestant versus Catholic, and Calvinist versus Lutheran. It comes out of the competition of religious states. In the medieval period, they had diarchy, which is an order where there's an international or universal order founded on law, on Roman law above all, and much less importantly on the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor is a person without power through most of the Middle Ages, doesn't count much in geopolitics, but the idea of an international order is based on law is very much alive until the very end of the Middle Ages. So the idea of diarchy is that you allow a great deal of local autonomy and that there's a superstructure which keeps the peace. This is where Middle Ages failed, but there's a superstructure which keeps the peace and allows localities to flourish. And there are other empires in the world that have had this diarchic structure, non-ideological empires like the Roman Empire of the first and second centuries AD. These are non-ideological, but they respect a certain amount of local autonomy. And I think the world that Tingyang Zhao talks about of the Zhou dynasty also aspired. I mean, China's much more culturally uniform during the Zhou dynasty, but and there's all sorts of unities of rights, for example, and culture. But I think it's also a diarchical organization, a diarchical structure. And I think the EU actually models that very well. It's customary to bash the EU these days, but I think the EU has been very successful at keeping a balance between an international or a transnational, let's say, order and not trying to abolish the culture of individual states. All sorts of debates about whether the EU should abolish tiny apples that they like in Denmark and they have standard size apples, but that's all kind of journalistic stuff. The EU, I think, has been very, very successful, and it could be scaled up. It could be a model for an international order. So my view is that what I'm arguing for in the paper is an international order that has very limited functions to keep the peace, to prevent aggression, to promote trade. And when I say prevent aggression, I mean also economic aggression, cultural aggression, resist global oligarchy, which is our main threat at the moment. An oligarchy consisting of large corporations, tech giants, international NGOs, bad internationalists, it's been called that. It's really Western cultural imperialism in disguise. So if you had an international order that tried to control those things without abolishing local civilizations, local political autonomy, that's the kind of order that one should aim at. I'll just finish by reading one paragraph, if I have time for that, from the paper. So we have it, this is from the paper, we have at present a globalized world, but we do not have a world, in my opinion, that is even close to being able to establish a universal moral order oriented to peace and the flourishing of all peoples, or procreative growth, Sheng Sheng to use Professor Zhao's term. We're not yet all under heaven. My late colleague Sam Huntington used to warn that we were heading for a clash of civilizations. I wish that we were so advanced morally as to be capable of a clash of civilizations. In fact, the real problem is that world civilizations are dying. They no longer civilize us. They no longer train us in the civil virtues. They're being pushed out of our schools and into museums. We live instead in a world of colluding oligarchies who all speak the same language of power and wealth, usually in English, and are hostile to the civilizations of the world, those older and sounder moral traditions. The civilizing traditions of the world, in my opinion, are the only defenses that can stand against the ideological tyranny of globalized capital and the homogenization of values promoted by Western NGOs and other predatory international organizations. My view is that if we want to get to a benevolent Tianxia order of peace and flourishing, we have to begin by strengthening and improving our civilizing traditions. Compatible universalism, that's Professor Zhao's term, is only possible among civilizations that teach not universal moral laws or a single world philosophy, but dispositions of goodwill and fairness, and inculcate a horror of aggression and destructive forms of competition. In other words, based on virtue and not based on rules. Okay, I'll stop there.